Dear church, let's talk about urban ministry with Dr. Steve Cloer. Dear church, let's talk Holy Spirit, transformation, prayer.
6 days, right?
And if you love me, you will keep my commandments.
Our culture wants to define you by your sexuality. We know that our identity is found in Christ.
Hello and welcome to the Dear Church podcast. I'm your host, Chris McCurley, joined today by a longtime friend, Dr. Steve Cloer. Steve, you and I go back to youth ministry days many years ago, and I was in Batesville, Arkansas. You were in Cave City, Arkansas. That's been a while, hasn't it? What, 20-something years ago, maybe?
Yes, that was probably back in 2003, my one and only year as a youth minister.
You did so well, it was time to move on.
Yeah, no, that's one way of putting it, maybe.
Yeah, we had a good time doing things together with our youth groups, and of course, I was coming out of coaching and just getting into ministry, and you had a big hand in helping me through that, and I felt like I learned something from you during that time. Of course, your dad, a longtime professor at Harding, Eddie Cloer, whose writings have helped me tremendously, and I know that everybody tells you how much he's helped them, and that's got to be a proud son moment for you. And so we can't get away from each other. We were at Arkansas, and then I moved to Texas. You're in Texas. You're in Fort Worth. I'm in Abilene, a couple hours apart. And you're at the Southside Church of Christ there in Fort Worth. And talk a little bit about kind of where you're at now, your family, kind of what you're doing there in Memphis.
Yeah. So again, thank you again for having me on. Sure. I was in Southside Church of Christ in Fort Worth, Texas for 15 years as the preacher there. And that was from 2006 to 2021. And then in 2021, we made the transition to Memphis, Tennessee, for me to work with Harding School of Theology and to teach courses in mission, leadership, ministry, and then direct the Doctor of Ministry program. And then Harding made the decision to relocate the School of Theology to the main campus in Searcy, Arkansas. And that decision was made in 2023, and then it took a year for the transition to happen, and basically fully relocated in 2024. Well, whenever that was going on, I asked Harding if I could stay in Memphis because my kids, I have 3 children, and at the time in 2024, my son was getting ready to start his senior year, and so it was not the best time to relocate, and so Harding began to work with me on that. In the process of that, Harding realized that one of the losses of moving the School of Theology to Searcy, Arkansas, was losing the urban connection. So for 66 years, Harding School of Theology was located right in the heart of Memphis, Tennessee, providing a really good urban context for ministry training. They were losing that, and there was a gain in that. The gain was that now they could offer a class for $300, $100 a credit hour, which is tremendous, and that's brought enrollment growth, so that's good. But the loss in that is the loss to an urban connection, urban center, and so Harding didn't really want to lose that. And so in all of this discussion, the idea was pitched of what if I stayed in Memphis and I directed a new initiative for Harding called the Center for Church and City Engagement. And so this initiative would then be Harding's effort to stay connected to Memphis, but even beyond that, to stay connected with the urban world. And so I'm directing this new initiative, and in addition to directing the Doctor of Ministry program and continuing to teach courses as well. So kind of have a lot of hats that I wear, but it's worked out. And my son graduated high school back in May, and I now have a junior as well, junior girl this year, and then I have an 8th grade girl. Oh, and I should say my son graduated, and now he's a freshman at Harding. So things are going well, and we've navigated the transition and excited about the work that I'm doing now.
Yeah, and it is exciting. And how did you kind of fall into urban ministry? Because I know that when you were at Southside, and correct me if I've got my story wrong here, but it seems like, as I recall you and I talking about this, when you were at Fort Worth, the elders were discussing maybe moving out of a disparaged area, perhaps in Fort Worth, and relocating, and made the decision, no, that the church is needed right here in this area. And again, if I remember correctly, you actually moved into the neighborhood, built a house there, and got involved in the school there and everything with your kids, and just took advantage of a real opportunity to reach folks in that area. Am I correct on all that?
Yeah, very good. Good memory. So it's kind of a weird situation because I grew up in a small town in Searcy, Arkansas, from birth to basically graduating from Harding University in 2002. And then married my wife, Lindsay, and we stayed an extra year. And while she was getting her master's degree, and that's when I was working at Cave City, driving back and forth. And then after that year, we moved to Memphis for me to get my Master's of Divinity degree from Harding School of Theology. And those 3 years in Memphis were really transformative, not just in the classes that I took, but just living in Memphis and seeing the challenges of a large city where there's racial tension, where there's significant poverty, where I worked in campus ministry during that time. And so I was on a secular college campus on a regular basis. And so just seeing all of these dynamics that really shaped me and challenged me in many ways. And so then when the opportunity came to look for a preaching job, at first I wanted to get outside the Bible Belt. That was my desire. I wanted kind of a mission situation where I was outside the Bible Belt. But then when I interviewed at Southside in Fort Worth, that church really captured our hearts. Partially just it was a very loving, kind church, but part of it was this sense of mission and calling that the church had, that located 2 miles south of downtown, so in the heart of the city. At the time, especially in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, the area had kind of bottomed out a little bit economically because of people moving to the suburbs.
Sure.
And the church had thought about moving out as well, but they made a commitment to staying. And that was probably in the late 80s or 90s, somewhere in that time frame. They made the decision to stay, and we're going to try to minister to the neighborhood. And that desire really captured me, and I realized this was a mission situation. At least that's the way I thought about it then. I would say every church is a mission situation now, but at the time that really captured me, and they wanted to reach out. So when I came there, that was the goal. Hey, we're going to be a church, a missional church, reaching the neighborhood and figuring out ways to do that. And about halfway through the 15 years I was there, our family did move into the neighborhood. Just felt like that's where we needed to be to help the church be even more connected to the neighborhood. We felt like we could extend the ministry of the church that way. Our kids went to the neighborhood public school as they were in elementary, and so that provided a lot of ministry outlet for our family, but also for the church. And we learned a lot through all of that. And so I think the time in Memphis when I was getting my master's degree, and then the time in Fort Worth, and then being in the urban neighborhood, that's really how I kind of got involved in city ministry. And then when I transitioned back to Memphis to work at Harding School of Theology, the idea there was I want to train leaders to do what I was doing in Fort Worth. And in fact, when I shared that dream with the elders, they told me and said, "You've got to go do this. I mean, we're going to miss you, and this is going to be really sad for us, but you need to go." And so my last Sunday at Southside, they prayed a prayer of sending over me, that they sent me to Memphis with this sense of call of train more leaders to lead churches in urban areas for the mission of God. So that's kind of how I ended up where I am, I guess.
Yeah, what a great story. And so now, present day, you're in Memphis again, and certainly an urban area. And how's it going? What talks a little bit about some of the challenges, some of the victories that you've had there so far, and then I want to talk strategy. So, talk a little bit about challenges and victories first.
Okay, sure. So came to Memphis, and to be here with the School of Theology. I guess one of the challenges was just navigating the transition of the School of Theology to
Right.
Searcy, but now leading the Center for Church and City Engagement, which is out of the Holmes Road Church of Christ. I office out of this church. They have become kind of the home base for this center, and which is it's a great place to have as a home base, because Holmes Road is another church that, very similar story, started in Whitehaven, which Whitehaven is a first ring suburb, we would call, of Memphis. So just right outside the 240 loop, on just the south side of downtown, and was a very well-known, well-to-do church back in the 70s, I guess, 70s and 80s. And then there was white flight that happened, where the neighborhood changed demographically, and a lot of the white families moved out east. And the church was faced with the decision: a historically white church, do we move to a neighborhood that is more congruent with our church population, at least racially, or do we stay into the neighborhood? And Holmes Road said, we're going to stay. God's planted us here. We're going to stay. And so they have embraced an African-American neighborhood. The church is now pretty much 50-50 white and black, and the eldership is 50-50. And so it's a really good example of a church committing to the neighborhood it's in, even in spite of demographic change, welcoming in neighbors, and the church changing as a result of that. And so it's a great place to kind of be a home base for the center. And in terms of just victories, challenges, cities have a lot of challenges. I think when I think of the challenges of cities, I think number one, you have diversity. So you have racial diversity, and particularly the larger the city, the larger diversity. And so you've got, I was in Washington, D.C. A couple weeks ago, meeting with church leaders there. And one church that I was meeting with, their church has 23 nations represented in their church. So that's a good
diverse
example. It's a good example of just the diversity. And so how do we come together across race and ethnicity? That's a challenge in cities. I think another big challenge is poverty. And now poverty is everywhere. It's in rural, small towns and everywhere. But in cities, it's more stark. It's in your face. It's right in front of you. So when I was in Fort Worth, right at our neighborhood in Southside, you could go 1 mile to the west and you could see big mansions that were more expensive than any of us could afford. And then you go 1 mile to the east and you'd see people sleeping outside, on the ground. So, how do I make sense of this dynamic where I go one way and I see very expensive homes, another way I see people sleeping outside because they don't have a place to stay. So that's the kind of dynamic you find in cities, is poverty and justice. How do I make sense of that? Immigration is another challenge. Refugees are often resettled. We have refugees being resettled in Memphis. There's a pretty growing immigrant population. And so you have all of the politics with immigration. You have the fear going on with immigrant families. How do we navigate all that? How do we welcome the immigrant? How do we welcome the refugee? So that's a challenge. And I would add another challenge is cities are chaotic. There's just a lot going on all the time. We live in a globalized world where if you work in a corporation, you work in a business, you're gonna be going here and there and everywhere. Sports is a big thing, and it's a big thing everywhere. But club sports and going here and doing this, and so in this busy culture that we live in, how do we slow down to notice the work of God among us? That's a challenge in a city. And I think with that busyness is the loneliness that comes often in cities. Even though you're surrounded by a lot of people, you can feel pretty lonely because maybe you came to this city leaving family behind to go to school or business. So these are all tremendous challenges. And what we're doing with the center is we're trying to find ways to bring churches together, to help churches think about these challenges, and to give some reflection, some ideas on how to engage the city for the mission of God.
Yeah, Steve, I grew up not far from Memphis. In fact, if we did anything on the weekend as a family, we usually went to Memphis. That was the go-to place. And growing up, Memphis was a thriving metropolitan area. And to say that it's kind of fallen on hard times is probably kind of accurate. And it's in the news a lot nowadays.
Yes.
And
Yes.
so I'm sure that is an added layer of challenges, as well. Because, I think urban is obviously a term that's kind of a sliding scale. Our church here in Dixon is downtown. So urban, perhaps, but not necessarily the same way, as Nashville or Memphis. But still, you're in the middle of the city, and there's challenges that come with that. And one of those is safety, and things of that nature. And there's a heightened awareness nowadays, especially with, church shootings making the news on a regular basis. And, we've heightened our security here. And, that's something that we have noticed that, you don't want to immediately assume the worst in somebody, but at the same time, you've got to be precautionary as well. So, I think that's
absolutely.
Another.
I appreciate you bringing that up. In Memphis, it's one way I describe it. So when I lived in Fort Worth and the neighborhood of the Southside building, the poverty rate was around 17-18%, which was higher than the national average. And so you could definitely sense poverty around.
Mm-hmm.
In Memphis, the whole city of Memphis has a poverty rate of 20%. So the whole city has a higher poverty rate than the neighborhood that I lived in Fort Worth.
Yeah.
And so then you're going into impoverished neighborhoods in Memphis. So like Frazier is typically referred to as an impoverished neighborhood. The poverty rate there is like 25 to 30%. Mm-hmm. So sometimes the statistic used around Memphis is that 1 in every 3 children is living in poverty. And if you take the idea of poverty and cut it into half. So you take the poverty line, cut it into half. That's called extreme poverty. I think it's around 75,000 in Memphis live in extreme poverty. So the poverty is higher. Poverty is often tied to racial tension. Mm-hmm. And so, and just kind of the racial history, and then all that can also be connected to the crime rate. So high poverty is going to be high crime rate. So we see that in Memphis, and obviously that's in the news. We got National Guard and that kind of thing. But I really like the mayor of Memphis. I really like the direction that the city is going. There is a big initiative around hope that is going to be coming out here shortly about hope for Memphis and a city that's based on hope. I really like that. It plays really well with scripture. And so I really like things that are happening. There's a lot of faith-based ministries in Memphis that are trying to help the situation. I like to tell people Memphis is a really good laboratory for ministry, because you've got all the dynamics that you would see in a large city, but you also have a lot of different ministries and churches that are really trying to do some innovative things to deal with the challenges around. And so I'm very hopeful about the future of Memphis, and I'm hopeful about the future of the church in Memphis, and I'm just excited to see, where God moves next.
Yeah, and that is exciting, and I'm thankful for your efforts and the efforts of others, because it's just easy to cut bait and move on, right? That's the easy thing, to stick it out and be a leader moving forward, I mean, I think that's a higher calling that we all need to be, bought into. So as we kind of turn the discussion to strategy, I'm sure we have folks that are tuning in wondering, okay, we know what the issues are, we know what the challenges are, we know what the difficulties might be. How do we implement a program where we can reach those around us, whether it be a big city, smaller city? What does urban ministry look like from Steve Cloer's perspective if you're going to try to put this into action?
Yeah. Well, I want to answer that question by sharing some research that the center has been doing. So, one of the questions I wrestled with is, how do you start an academic center?
Yeah.
And I felt like the way to begin was to listen, because I think good leaders listen. And so we did a listening tour. In fact, the listening tour is kind of ongoing, but we've done a listening tour where we've gone to 6 different cities, actually now 7 cities. And we've pulled together church leaders and just listened. And we've asked them questions around, what is God doing in your city? What are the barriers holding your church back from joining God's mission in your city? What's one dream that God has for your city that you want your church to be a part of? And what are the tools and resources that your church needs to join God's work in the city? So those are the 4 questions we asked. And we've done that with about 150 leaders from around 75 churches in 7 different cities. So Memphis was the first place, and then Little Rock, Dallas-Fort Worth area, Houston, Chicago, Atlanta, and then we just were at Washington, D.C. And so that's giving us good research around where our priorities need to be focused in terms of how the center can help churches, but also if you're a church leader in a city, where does your focus need to be? And so out of that, there have been 5, what I call 5 strategic priorities that I think if I'm a church leader in an urban area, these are 5 things I need to be thinking about, that we, as an eldership, we need to be talking about. These are 5 things that we need to be preaching on, that sort of thing. So those 5 things are, number 1, how do we partner with or collaborate with other churches or ministries across race and theological difference? So this priority is around partnership. If you're going to do ministry in the city, you can't do it by yourself. The needs are too overwhelming. It's too overwhelming for a local church. But if we can work together with other churches, if we can find ways to do things together, to partner together, to come together, particularly across race, God can really move in powerful ways. And I sensed that in Fort Worth. I mean, we did some racial unity gatherings. We partnered with different nonprofit ministries all the time. Partnership is critical if you're going to really make a difference in the city. And so I think that's number 1. Number 2 is, how can we slow down to notice God's new work in the city? And so there's 2 pieces to that. Number 1 is the slow down piece, which I mentioned earlier, that we're just so busy.
Yeah.
And so we've got to learn the ability to slow down, listen, notice what God is up to, discern what God is doing. But the second piece of that is God's new work. So one interesting piece in the research was we heard words like awakening and revival and providence and hope and spiritual openness, that there was this sense that God's doing something. I don't know exactly what. I don't know exactly what this means. And that really aligns well with like Barna's recent research around Gen Z being more open to spiritual. So, but if we're not careful, we may miss what God's doing because we're too busy.
Right.
So I think it's finding ways to slow down. So that's number 2. Then number 3 is, how can we be a missionary church to the neighborhood? And so this third priority is, we've got to think like missionaries. We've got to think the way a missionary would think, which is, I'm in a new place. I need to get to know this place. I need to learn this new place. I need to find where are the ministry entry points, just like Paul did when he went to Athens and he found that altar to the unknown God. Where's the ministry entry points that we can connect with? How can we be missionaries in this place? So we're not going to think about how simply to take care of one another as a church. We're going to think about how we can be a missionary team together in this place. So that's number 3. Number 4 is, what are faithful practices of mercy and justice? And so everywhere we went, every city, and this is what happens in cities, is you see the injustice around you. You just can't help but notice it, as I mentioned earlier. And so how do we help with people who are broken and families that are falling apart and where there's poverty? Like, how do we do that well? To where we're not hurting people, where we're doing this in a scriptural way? That's a key question, and it's a question that every leader that we talked to was wrestling with. And so I think that's very important. And then number 5 is, how can we equip and empower ministry leaders to participate in the mission of God? And so I use this word ministry leader to describe not the preacher, but to describe the elder, the deacon, the small group leader, the Bible class teacher, the one who's the committee chair who's leading that ministry. Those people, how do we equip and train and empower them? We heard that there's plenty of training for preachers. They can get a master's degree or whatever. But what about that, sweet lady who's run the clothing ministry for, 10 years? How is she getting trained and equipped so that she can be a more faithful servant and more faithful worker in the kingdom? And so that's what we heard a lot. And so finding ways for your church to be a place to equip more workers for the kingdom, I think is really important. So those 5 to me are kind of priorities that I think churches need to be thinking about. Our Center for Church City Engagement is going to be thinking about as well.
I think that's great because, we have a tendency to focus inward, and maintaining what we have built as a church. And I say it all the time to our congregation here is, we often bemoan the fact that, we're not the church like they were in the first century, or we need to get it back to that, and we need to replicate that, be who they were, do what they did. And most of our focus in that is what happens in worship, which is fine and good. But they were a movement. They were an everyday church. They were outside of the walls doing things and reaching people and spreading the gospel to all parts of the earth. And so what you're saying really speaks to that mission, is that, yes, what we do when we're together is important, but there's a time to gather and a time to scatter, right?
That's exactly right. And I like the way you put that. There's a time to gather and time to scatter. And I don't think we need to minimize the gathered life of the church when we're coming together to worship, to pray, to read God's word, to fellowship with one another. I mean, we need that time. And that time can be a witness to the world that, here's what it looks like when God's people come together, and it's a really special thing. But sometimes, yes, we can get so focused on that part of us and thinking that that's who we are, just to take care of one another. I like to say sometimes the vision of a local church is just to do, Sunday worship again. we did it this Sunday, and let's do it again next, and just try to do it a little bit better next time. And so we need a broader vision, and maybe a way to capture that is to say, okay, how can we embody the gospel in this place at this time? And so for some reason, God has placed us here as a community in this city or in this neighborhood or this corner of the city. He's placed us here, and he didn't place us there. He didn't place us some other place. And we're not talking about 1985. We're not talking about 1995. We're talking about 2025. And so how do we embody the gospel in this place and at this time? And I think that question can lead us down a good path. And it can help us think through, okay, how do we be missionaries in this place? How do we show acts of mercy and justice in this place? How do we come together with other like-minded believers and do the work of God together? It can lead us down some of those directions that I think are really healthy, and I think God can do great things through.
No doubt. Man, great discussion, Steve. Thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule to join us today. And, we're about the same distance we were in Texas apart. We need to get together and
That's exactly
have
right.
some coffee. Yeah.
Yes.
So if somebody wants more information on this, I'm going to encourage them to email me, chris.mccurley@rippleoflight.com. And if you have a specific request of Dr. Cloer, we can forward that on to him. If you want to know more about strategy and all that kind of stuff, any materials that you can give them access to. Is there anything else, Steve, that you want to say as far as people maybe wanting to know more about this?
Yeah, I appreciate that. And I appreciate the opportunity again. We have a website, harding.edu/CCCE, and I'll pass that on to you, Chris. And we have a
Sure.
Substack, which is kind of like a blog called Church and City Substack. And I'll
Right.
pass that information to you, Chris. But that's a good place to you can subscribe to that Substack, and there'll be content coming out every week just around those 5 priorities that I mentioned, helping churches, giving stories of what churches are doing and that sort of thing. So I want to make sure that people are aware of that.
Yeah, fantastic. Again, thank you, Steve. I want to thank everyone for tuning in. And until next time, may the Lord bless you and keep you. Sincerely, Chris.